All right, we are continuing our study of the book of Exodus here on the listener's commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 5 through 11. This is the well-known 10 plagues on Egypt section. So it really goes together as one big unit of thought. It's a big chunk. There's too much to cover in one recording, so we're going to do it in a couple recordings. So we'll begin looking at Exodus 5 through 11 here, and we'll finish it on the next recording. And let's just consider the context so we remember where we're at in the flow of the story. The people of Israel are suffering under the heavy hand of Egyptian oppression. God has heard their cries, He's remembered His covenant, and He's called Moses to be their deliverer. And after some negotiations, Moses has finally agreed to go. And we need to remember that at this stage in his life, Moses is 80 years old. In fact, that'll get mentioned a little bit later in this section we're looking at. Moses is 80 years old. He lived 40 years in Egypt as part of the royal palace. And then for the last 40 years, he has lived as a shepherd in Midian, married to the daughter of the priest of Midian. And now, at this stage in the story, he has met his brother somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula, and together they have returned to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. And that confrontation is really actually a confrontation between God and Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. It's not always clear necessarily in the 10 plagues that a specific plague is attacking an Egyptian god. What is clear, however, is that together they clearly attack the Egyptian worldview and the Egyptian religious system of beliefs. For example, frogs. Well, the god Hecate was the frog goddess and giver of life. In fact, she was even at times viewed as the patron goddess of midwives who assisted in childbirth. So that's significant. Or another one of the Egyptian gods was Hathor, who was a goddess sometimes portrayed as a cow. The plague of like boils or skin diseases of various kinds was the kind of thing that clearly indicated divine disapproval. And certainly the 9th plague, darkness on the land, well, that's clearly a plague targeting one of the highest gods in ancient Egypt, the sun god, Ra. And Pharaoh himself was viewed as divine. He was the one through whom the gods ruled Egypt. And so the 10 plagues are not random. They are really ultimately about who is the true God and who has ultimate power. And so we pick up the story there with Moses and Aaron now having returned to Egypt and preparing to confront Pharaoh. And so Exodus chapter 5, verse 1 says, "And afterward Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord,'" and he uses the word Lord there, Yahweh, that's God's name. "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness." Now, here's what's interesting about this initial interaction of Moses and Pharaoh is this is not exactly what God told Moses to say in Exodus 3:18. It kind of seems like Moses and Aaron along with him overstated things and got off on the wrong foot with Pharaoh. I don't know that it would have made any difference in the long run, probably wouldn't have. But what they were actually told to do was go together with the elders of Israel. Instead, they went alone. And they were given specific words to say, but here what they say is essentially a demand. They issued an order to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, "Let my people go." Pharaoh didn't take that well, so look at verse 2. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord?" Again, that's Yahweh. "Who is Yahweh, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, and besides, I will not let Israel go." Egypt has its own set of gods, but Pharaoh doesn't know the Lord, that is Yahweh. He doesn't know who Yahweh is, and he has no regard for him. His point is, whether he's ever heard of Yahweh before or not, the main thing is that Yahweh has no authority here, not in my court, not in the nation of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron back off in verse 3 and actually return to what God told them to say in 3:18. Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise, he will strike us with plague or with sword." Again, this is more in line with what God had told them to say in 3:18. But Pharaoh's already on edge, and he doubles down and digs his heels in. So, verse 4, "But the king of Egypt said, 'Moses and Aaron, why do you let the people neglect their work? Get back to your labors.'" Remember, the people of Israel were serving as sort of a slave force, labor force for Pharaoh and Egypt. So he's saying, look, you're just derailing that whole thing. You guys get back to your work. And again, Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from their labors? The workforce is too huge, and if I let you leave, if we put this whole thing on pause, do you realize the impact that would be on Egypt and on our economy and on our workforce? So no, get back to work." That's how Pharaoh responds. Well, then in verses 6 through 19 of chapter 5, Pharaoh actually makes matters worse for the people of Israel. And he does so specifically because he's hoping to motivate the people of Israel not to listen to Moses and Aaron. And so Pharaoh summoned his taskmasters, the Israelite foremen, and basically said, "You are no longer to give the people straw to make their bricks." So when they would make these clay bricks, they would add straw in it to make them stronger. And you're no longer to provide that. They got to go find their own straw, is what he tells them. And they still have to make the same number of bricks as they've always made. These people are lazy. That's why they're trying to get out of their work. So now we're going to actually double down and we're going to make things worse. No straw for you. Find your own straw. Make the same number of bricks. The Israelite foreman protested. "Why are you doing this?" Pharaoh said, "It's because you're lazy and that's why you want to leave. So same quota, no straw, get back to work." And the foremen realized they were in real trouble. There's no way they could actually produce the same number of bricks while having to find their own straw. So they leave Pharaoh's presence and they come to Moses and Aaron. Verse 20 says, "When they left Pharaoh and they met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them, and they said to them, 'May the Lord look upon you and judge you, because you've made us repulsive in Pharaoh's sight and in the sight of his servants. You've effectively put a sword in their hand to kill us.'" That's what the Israelite foremen say to Moses and Aaron. So Moses responds by immediately going to the Lord in prayer and states his complaint and his case to the Lord. Exodus chapter 5, verse 22 says, "Moses returned to the Lord and said, 'Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name,'" which that phrase is interesting to me. It suggests that there's been more interaction and a little bit more time than the narrative in Exodus makes it seem like. "Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's done harm to this people, and you haven't rescued your people at all." Notice how direct Moses is with God. "God, you haven't done what you said. You haven't delivered your people. You haven't rescued them at all." Then, as we begin chapter 6, God replies. He says to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for under compulsion he will let them go, and under compulsion he will drive them out from this land." So you watch and see what happens, because I am going to force Pharaoh's hand, and he will eventually let them go. But it's going to take some compulsion to make that happen. And then God spoke further to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord." That is, I am Yahweh. When you see Lord written in all capitals in your Bible, that's the cue that we're talking about God's name, Yahweh. That's what we have here. I am Yahweh, and I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob as God Almighty, as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, I didn't make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land which they lived in as strangers. Furthermore, I've heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Now, when God says, again, I remembered my covenant, that doesn't mean that God also is like, oh yeah, I remember when I did that. When he says he remembered, it means he's become mindful of and decided now is the time to act on behalf of his covenant promises. You see, God has his own pace and his own timetable, and he has his own reasons for that. And so at this moment, the story is ready to move forward, and God is ready to act to move the story forward in keeping with his covenant that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so in chapter 6, verse 6, God says this to Moses, "Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the labors of the Egyptians, and I will rescue you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments." And again, if you look at a lot of the archaeological pictures that show the engravings of Pharaoh, when Pharaoh wants to demonstrate his power and his might, it's a picture of Pharaoh with his arm stretched up high, usually some sort of rod in his hand. That's a symbol of his strength. And God says, that's what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. I'm going to stretch out my arm and I will demonstrate my power over Pharaoh, and I will redeem you out from your bondage. That's the basic idea of redemption or redeem. It has this idea of liberating from bondage, usually at some sort of cost. But notice it also here entails Israel becoming God's own people and them as a people coming to God. So you're not just leaving Egypt, you're also becoming God's particular people. The Exodus is the great act of redemption in the Old Testament, whereby God delivers Israel from their Egyptian bondage and forms them into his own people. And so when the New Testament refers to the redemption that's in Jesus, it's actually saying God has acted again to achieve a second Exodus, another great act of redemption by which people are set free, in this case, set free from the power and the lordship of sin, and they're formed and made into God's people now in Jesus Christ. And so God's going to redeem them with an outstretched arm. And then God states the aim or the goal of redeeming them. He says, "Then I will take you as my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am Yahweh, your God." You'll know me by name. You'll know who I am. You'll know me as your God who brought you out from under the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am Yahweh. I'm the Lord. So Moses did this. Moses said this to the sons of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and their cruel bondage. They were so overwhelmed. Things had been bad, and now they've gone from bad to worse, and they didn't listen to Moses. Now, chapter 6, verse 10, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Go, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the sons of Israel go out of his land." But Moses responded before the Lord, saying, "Behold, the sons of Israel haven't listened to me. How then will Pharaoh listen to me, as I'm unskilled in speech?" It's like, if my own people won't listen to me, why in the world would Pharaoh listen to me? Not only that, he brings up the same issue that he had brought up at the burning bush. I'm not a great speaker. I'm unskilled in speech. Nevertheless, the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron and gave them a command concerning the sons of Israel and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt. So God instructs them and commands them, go do this, speak this word. And then what we get, interestingly, is a bit of a pause in the action in chapter 6, 14 through 25. There's this pause, and we are given a genealogy. What's this doing here? Why all of a sudden this genealogy that shows up, it seems like, in a random place right in the middle of the action? Well, it seems like this genealogy is here specifically to establish Moses and Aaron's identity and credibility. who were these two that God commanded to go to Pharaoh and to bring Israel out of Egypt? So you get the genealogy to say, here's who they are. Here's their identity, and this is why they have credibility. And so after this genealogy, chapter 6, verse 26 says, it was this same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring the sons of Israel out from the land of Egypt according to their multitudes. This very Moses listed off at the end of this genealogy, this very Aaron along with him, they're the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing the sons of Israel out from Egypt. It was this same Moses and Aaron. So you can hear the emphasis and how that genealogy is there to help us know, oh, it's this Moses and Aaron. This is where they came from. This is why they have credibility. Now, it came about on that very day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spoke to Moses saying, I am Yahweh. Say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you. But Moses, once again before the Lord, said, I'm unskilled in speech. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? And God responds once again in chapter 7. The Lord said to Moses, look, I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. In other words, just as God speaks to prophets and then prophets speak to the people, well, that's the way it's going to be to you. I'll speak to you, Moses, and Aaron will be your prophet who will speak on your behalf to Pharaoh. And so Aaron's going to be your spokesperson. As for you, you shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. We've already seen this a time or two. God has warned Moses that it's not going to go well. It's going to take compulsion. God's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. It's said here. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment, that there's this interplay between God's activity and Pharaoh's activity. So I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh's heart's going to be stubborn and hard, and there's a purpose for it, so that God may demonstrate his power and his might, his signs and his wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand on Egypt, and I will bring out my armies, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt with great judgments. And so God's going to, by signs and wonders, pour out his judgment on the nation of Egypt. And once again, there is a goal in this for the people of Egypt. Then the Egyptians shall know, chapter 7, verse 5, they shall know that I am Yahweh, I am the Lord, when I extend my hand over Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. And so God, through his signs and wonders done through Moses, one of his aims in that is to make it clear that he is the one true God, even to the Egyptians, not only to the Israelites, as we already saw in chapter 6, but here in chapter 7, also to the Egyptians, that they might know that I am the Lord. So Moses and Aaron did this. As the Lord commanded them, so they did. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So now the confrontation with Pharaoh begins in earnest. And so in chapter 7, verses 8 through 12, what you get is the initial sort of significant confrontation. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you saying, work a miracle, here's what you're going to do. You're going to tell Aaron to take his staff, throw it down on the ground, and that's what happens. Aaron throws his staff on the ground. It turns into a serpent. The word translated serpent there is usually the word that refers to some sort of sea creature, like a crocodile or something else, not just an ordinary snake. And so it turns into some sort of serpent. But Pharaoh himself, he's unimpressed. And so what he does is he actually calls for his sorcerers and his wise men, and they used their secret arts as soothsayers of Egypt, and they threw down their staffs, and those staffs became some sort of serpent as well. But Aaron's staff, that had become a serpent, ate up their staffs. And yet, chapter 7, verse 13, and yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he didn't listen to them, just as the Lord said would happen, just as the Lord predicted. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, and he refuses to let my people go. Now, let's pause right here for just a moment, because these two verses illustrate something we see throughout these chapters about Pharaoh's heart. We have Pharaoh's heart was hardened in verse 13. Then in verse 14, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. And what we get in those two verses is not only two descriptions of Pharaoh's heart, hardened and stubborn, but even in Hebrew, it's two different words. And the word translated hardened is more this idea of like made resolute. Pharaoh was made stout-hearted. It's actually a word that sometimes could be used almost in Egypt as like a prize trait, to have a Pharaoh who he never feared anybody. He was resolute in the face of danger. He was a stout-hearted Pharaoh. It could almost be praised as a high quality. Interestingly enough, in the story of the 10 plagues that's about to begin, when we talk about Pharaoh's heart being hardened, one of the words is this word, resolute, strengthened, stout-hearted. And God's always the one that is said to make his heart stout-hearted or strengthened it. That's usually the word that's used when we talk about God's activity. Or when it's like in verse 13 where the subject isn't clear, it's passive. His heart was just that. It was resolute. It was stout-hearted. He had this quality, right? When it talks about what Pharaoh does to his own heart, it's actually the word kabod in Hebrew, which means heavy. Like Pharaoh's heart became heavy. Ironically, this is a vice in the Egyptian thought world. In fact, at the end of a Pharaoh's life, they would actually extract his heart before they mummified him. They'd put it on a scale with a feather on the other side of the scale. And supposedly a virtuous Pharaoh, who was a virtuous and wise ruler, well, his heart would be lighter than a feather. And the point was that if you were a noble, wise, virtuous ruler, you would have a light heart. So when we get Pharaoh's heart strengthened, it's like he's a stout-hearted, resolute, strong ruler. When we get Pharaoh's heart being stubborn or heavy, what we're saying is, and it's not a good thing, he refuses to let the people go. And as a result of his heavy, self-serving heart, he's actually going to bring destruction and damage upon the nation of Egypt. And so you get both those words in the story of the 10 plagues, and you get both God making Pharaoh's heart resolute or strong. Only one time is it said that God makes Pharaoh's heart heavy, and you get Pharaoh choosing to make his heart heavy. And so we get this interplay of God's action and Pharaoh's action where, okay, Pharaoh's got this strong, stubborn, resolute heart where he's a strong leader, and yet because of that, he keeps doing things that are foolish and unwise and bringing guilt and heaviness to his heart that's going to destroy his kingdom. And eventually, after the first handful of plagues, it's going to say, fine, God's like, you want a resolute heart, Pharaoh? A resolute heart that's going to destroy your kingdom? I will give you a resolute heart. And God just begins to turn up the dial on Pharaoh's stout-heartedness that leads to his heavy-heartedness. And so we see that theme right here in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, side by side, and we can watch for it now in the rest of the 10 plagues story that picks up in force now, beginning in the middle of chapter 7 here in 7:15. That's where we'll pause right now, this recording, and we'll pick up in the next recording with the 10 plagues on the nation of Egypt. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton to each and every one of you who makes this ministry possible. And if you have been challenged, built up by this ministry, and want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and that'll redirect you to page at World Family Mission, my page, where you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it a recurring monthly donation, click that little box that says make this monthly, and all those funds will come my way to help this ministry continue to grow and increase and reach more people so that more and more people can learn and live the Bible. Thanks a ton for your support.